My name is Lily Chen, and for the first 18 years I can remember, I believed I was exactly what the Zhang family told me I was: slow, ungrateful, and incredibly lucky that anyone had taken me in at all. I was adopted at age 4 from a rural orphanage in China. I have no memories of my biological parents, no understanding of why I was given up, no connection to whatever life existed before the Zhangs. My earliest memory is of Mrs. Zhang, Chen Mei, looking down at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and saying, "You will work hard and be grateful. That is how you repay the gift we've given you." I didn't understand then that love wasn't supposed to come with conditions. I didn't understand that families weren't supposed to operate like businesses, with debts and credits and constant reminders of what you owed. I didn't understand that the gift of adoption shouldn't require repayment through 18 years of unpaid labor. But I understand now. And the Zhang family is about to learn that the slow girl they exploited for nearly 2 decades became something they never anticipated, their worst nightmare. This is the story of how I went from sleeping on a cot in a restaurant storage room to owning every piece of leverage that could destroy the people who raised me. This is the story of how the servant became the master. This is the story of how patience, documentation, and perfect timing can turn powerlessness into absolute control. And this is the story of how I'm going to use that control. I grew up in the back rooms of Golden Dragon, the flagship restaurant in what would eventually become the Zhang family's empire of 7 high-end Chinese restaurants across 3 states. My adoptive father, Zhang Wei, had immigrated to America in his 20s with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work 18-hour days. He had built Golden Dragon from a tiny takeout place into an elegant dining establishment that attracted wealthy clientele and critical acclaim. By the time I was adopted, the family was successful, but not yet wealthy. They were still in the grinding phase of building something bigger. I was brought in to help with that building. From the age of 4, my education consisted of learning how to set tables, wash dishes, prep vegetables, and stay out of sight when customers were present. While my adoptive siblings, Jason, who was 6 when I arrived, and Susan, who was 8, went to school and had tutors and participated in extracurricular activities, I worked. "Lily is special," Mrs. Zhang would explain to anyone who asked why I wasn't enrolled in school. "She learns differently. Traditional education wouldn't work for her. We're teaching her practical skills instead, things that will help her support herself when she's older." The subtext was clear to anyone listening. I was intellectually disabled, incapable of academic learning, suited only for manual labor. And because I was young and had no frame of reference for what was normal, I believed it. I believed I was slow. I believed I was lucky. I believed that the 12-hour days I spent washing dishes and scrubbing floors were evidence of the Zhang's generosity rather than exploitation. The reality was very different. I wasn't slow, I was actually quite intelligent, something I wouldn't discover until much later. But I had been deliberately kept illiterate and innumerate, denied any education that might help me understand my situation or imagine alternatives. I was fed, housed, and worked to exhaustion, kept in a state of perpetual gratitude that prevented me from questioning the fundamental unfairness of my existence. This continued for years. While Jason and Susan went to private schools and summer camps and college prep courses, I worked in the restaurant. As the Zhang Empire expanded, a second restaurant when I was 7, a third when I was 9, eventually growing to 7 locations by the time I was 16, my responsibilities grew proportionally. I became the ghost in their machine. I would start at 4 a.m., prepping ingredients at one location, then move to another restaurant to help with lunch service, then to another for dinner prep, then back to the original location to clean after closing. I worked every single day, without exception, without complaint, because I genuinely believed this was normal, that this was what adoption meant. The Zhangs were careful to maintain the fiction. They filed the minimum required paperwork for homeschooling, claiming they were educating me at home while actually doing nothing of the sort. They kept me away from situations where outsiders might ask too many questions. They monitored my interactions, controlled my access to information, and ensured that I remained isolated from anyone who might tell me that what was happening to me was wrong. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated how much I was absorbing. Even though I couldn't read or write, I could listen, I could observe, I could remember. I listened to their business conversations, learning about profit margins and supplier negotiations and health code violations they were skirting. I observed the way they treated employees versus family, the hierarchy of who mattered and who was disposable. I remembered every slight, every insult, every moment when they made it clear that I was less than human in their eyes. And I began to understand that something was wrong. The turning point came when I was 13 years old. A new employee started working at Golden Dragon, a woman named Maria who had immigrated from Mexico and spoke limited English. She was kind to me in a way that the Zhangs never were, sneaking me extra food and asking if I was okay when I looked exhausted. One day, during a quiet moment in the kitchen, she asked me a question that changed everything. "How old are you, Mija?" 13, I replied. "And you work here every day, you don't go to school." I explained about being slow, about learning differently, about how the Zhangs were kind enough to teach me practical skills instead of wasting time on schooling I couldn't handle. Maria's face darkened with an expression I couldn't identify at the time, but would later recognize as horror. "Mija, that's not right. All children go to school. It's the law, and you're not slow. I've watched you. You remember everything. You work faster than anyone else here. You understand complicated instructions. Someone is lying to you." Her words planted a seed of doubt that would grow over the following years. If I wasn't slow, why had the Zhangs told me I was? If school was legally required, why had no one enforced that requirement? If I was as capable as Maria suggested, what else had I been lied to about? I started paying attention differently. I started questioning, silently, the narrative I had always accepted. And I started planning. The problem was that I had no resources. I couldn't read or write, which meant I couldn't research my rights or document what was happening to me. I had no money. The Zhangs had never paid me a cent for my labor. I had no identification documents that I knew of, no social security card, no birth certificate, nothing that would prove I existed in any official capacity. I was trapped with no clear path to escape. But Maria helped me take the first steps. She taught me to read. We would meet in the storage room during her breaks, and she would use food labels and newspapers to teach me letters, then words, then sentences. It was slow going. I only had a few minutes here and there, stolen moments when the Zhangs weren't watching, but I was motivated in a way that made learning feel urgent rather than tedious. Within a year, I could read basic English. Within 2 years, I could read anything I could get my hands on, and once I could read, I could educate myself about everything else I had been denied. I learned that child labor laws prohibited what the Zhangs were doing to me. I learned that adoption didn't give parents the right to treat children as unpaid employees. I learned that I should have been in school, should have had health care, should have had rights that were being systematically violated. I learned that I had been enslaved. The word hit me like a physical blow when I first encountered it in an article about human trafficking. That was what this was. Not adoption, not charity, not a family taking in a child who needed help. It was trafficking. It was slavery. It was a crime. And the Zhangs were criminals. But I also learned something else, that escaping would be incredibly difficult. I was legally their daughter. I had no resources. If I went to authorities, it would be my word against theirs, the word of a girl with no education against a respected business family. They would claim I was troubled, lying, mentally impaired. They would produce the homeschooling paperwork that technically met legal requirements, even if it bore no resemblance to reality. I needed more than just the truth. I needed evidence. I needed leverage. I needed to become someone who couldn't be dismissed or ignored. So I started building my case. At 15, I began documenting everything. I stole a cheap smartphone that one of the restaurant employees had left behind, an older model that someone had planned to throw away. I taught myself to use it, hiding it in the storage room where I slept and charging it when no one was watching. I used that phone to record conversations, the Zhangs talking about how much money they saved by using me instead of paid employees, Mrs. Zhang laughing with her friends about how they had found the perfect solution to labor costs, Mr. Zhang instructing managers to tell any inspectors that I was a family member helping out, not an employee, so child labor laws didn't apply. I photographed documents when I could access the office, tax returns that didn't list me as a dependent, insurance policies that didn't cover me, business records that tracked my hours worked but listed my wages as zero. I recorded my own testimony, describing in detail what my life had been like, what I was required to do, what I had been denied. I time-stamped everything, creating a chronological record that would be difficult to dispute. And I kept working. I kept playing the role of the grateful, slow, adopted daughter. I gave them no reason to suspect that anything had changed. By the time I was 17, I had hundreds of hours of recordings, thousands of photographs, and a detailed written account of 18 years of exploitation. I had evidence that would bury the Zhangs if it ever became public. But I still had one major problem. I had no idea what to do with this evidence. Going to the authorities still felt risky. I didn't trust that the system would protect me rather than the successful business owners who employed dozens of people and paid significant taxes. I needed something more, some advantage that would make victory certain rather than possible. That advantage came from an unexpected source, the Zhang's own greed. When I turned 18, the family called me into the office for a meeting. This was unusual. They rarely bothered to formally speak with me about anything. I was worried that somehow they had discovered my documentation, that this was the confrontation I had been dreading. Instead, they presented me with an opportunity that was somehow worse than anything I had imagined. "Lily," Mr. Zhang began, "you're an adult now. We've spent 18 years raising you, feeding you, giving you a home. It's time for you to give back to this family in a more significant way." I waited silent, as I had learned to be. "We have a business associate," Mrs. Zhang continued. "Mr. Wang. He's 53, very successful, looking for a wife. His first wife died several years ago and he's ready to remarry. We've discussed the situation with him and he's willing to overlook your limitations in exchange for certain business considerations." The meaning crystallized slowly, horribly. They were trying to sell me. "Mr. Wang is willing to invest $2 million in our expansion plans," Mr. Zhang said. "In exchange, you will marry him. It's an excellent arrangement. You'll be taken care of for the rest of your life, and you'll finally be able to truly repay us for everything we've done for you." I stared at them, my mind racing. An arranged marriage to a man nearly 3 times my age, structured as a business transaction. This wasn't adoption. This wasn't family. This was human trafficking in its most literal sense. "You should be grateful," Susan added. She had joined the meeting, apparently aware of the plan. "Someone like you would never find a husband on your own. This is your only chance at a normal life." When I managed to ask, my voice steady despite the screaming in my head. "The wedding is planned for 3 months from now," Mrs. Zhang said. "That gives you time to prepare. Mr. Wang is a traditional man. He'll expect you to be obedient and hardworking. Fortunately, those are skills you already have." They dismissed me, already discussing wedding logistics and business terms, as if I had agreed to this arrangement, rather than simply failed to object. I went back to my storage room, sat on my cot, and felt something shift inside me. I was done being patient. I was done gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment. The right moment was now, before they could legally bind me to a man I had never met in an arrangement that would trap me forever. It was time to burn their world down. If you're watching this right now, if this story is making your blood boil, if you're rooting for Lily to destroy the people who did this to her, I need you to hit that like button right now. Smash it, let me know you're with me on this journey. I had 3 months to go from powerless victim to someone who could destroy the Zhang family completely and permanently. The first thing I did was convert my evidence into something more permanent and secure. I uploaded everything to multiple cloud storage accounts, created encrypted backups, and sent copies to email addresses I set up specifically for this purpose. I made sure that even if the Zhangs discovered my phone and destroyed it, the evidence would survive. The second thing I did was research exactly what crimes the Zhangs had committed and what the consequences would be. Child labor law violations, fines and potential criminal charges, tax fraud from failing to report my labor, significant penalties and possible imprisonment, human trafficking for forced labor, federal charges with mandatory minimum sentences, and the forced marriage arrangement they were trying to orchestrate. That opened up a whole new category of crimes, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking for sexual exploitation. The Zhangs weren't just bad people. They were criminals who had committed federal offenses that carried serious prison time. But I still needed more than just evidence of crimes. I needed leverage that would prevent them from wiggling out of consequences through expensive lawyers and well-placed connections. That's when I started researching the restaurants themselves. I had worked in these establishments for years, and I knew things that the health inspectors didn't. I knew about the corner cutting, the safety violations, the practices that would shut down a restaurant immediately if they were properly documented. So I documented them. I photographed the walk-in freezers where temperature controls were broken, creating conditions that allowed dangerous bacterial growth. I recorded the pest infestations that were being hidden rather than properly addressed. I documented the expired ingredients that were being used anyway, the cross-contamination in food prep areas, the employees working while sick because they weren't given paid time off. I gathered evidence of health code violations at every single one of the Zhang family's 7 restaurants. Then I researched the immigration status of the restaurant employees. The Zhangs employed a lot of undocumented workers, people like Maria, who were vulnerable and unlikely to report mistreatment because they feared deportation. The Zhangs exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly, paying below minimum wage and threatening anyone who complained. I carefully documented this too, though I was careful to protect the workers themselves. I wasn't trying to get anyone deported. I was trying to show the pattern of exploitation that the Zhangs had built their empire on. And then I made my final, most important discovery: the buildings themselves. The Zhangs didn't own all the properties that their restaurants occupied. 4 of the 7 locations were leased from landlords, but 3 of the restaurants, including the flagship Golden Dragon location, were in buildings that the Zhangs had purchased years ago. Those buildings had mortgages, large mortgages, with balloon payments coming due in the next year. And the Zhangs were struggling to meet their obligations. I found this information by carefully photographing documents in Mr. Zhang's office: bank statements, loan agreements, frantic emails with accountants about cash flow problems. The family looked successful from the outside, but internally they were leveraged to the breaking point. The planned expansion that my forced marriage was supposed to fund, it wasn't a growth opportunity. It was a desperate attempt to avoid bankruptcy. They needed Mr. Wang's $2 million not to expand, but to survive. This was the leverage I needed. Over the next month, I took several careful steps. First, I anonymously contacted the health department in each jurisdiction where the Zhangs operated restaurants. I provided detailed, time-stamped evidence of health code violations, along with information about when inspectors should arrive to catch the problems in action. Second, I reached out to a labor rights organization that specialized in helping trafficking victims. I explained my situation carefully, provided evidence, and asked for help navigating the legal system. They connected me with an attorney who specialized in these cases, a woman named Jennifer Park, who took one look at my documentation and told me it was the most comprehensive evidence package she had ever seen from a victim. Third, I identified the banks that held the mortgages on the Zhang properties. I researched the decision makers, the processes for foreclosure, the typical timelines for default situations. And fourth, I did something that would seem crazy if it hadn't worked perfectly. I started buying. I had no money of my own. The Zhangs had never paid me a cent, but I had something else: information. I knew when the Zhangs would be unable to make their mortgage payments. I knew which properties would go into default. I knew when those properties would be available for purchase at distressed prices. And I knew people who would be interested in that information. I reached out to a commercial real estate investment firm that specialized in distressed properties. Through Jennifer, I arranged a meeting where I presented my evidence about the Zhang family's financial situation, the upcoming defaults, the value of the properties if they could be acquired at the right price. In exchange for this information and my cooperation in ensuring that the timing worked out, I negotiated a deal. The investment firm would hire me as a consultant, paying me a salary and giving me an equity stake in the properties once they were acquired. When the Zhangs defaulted, the firm would purchase the properties, and I would end up owning a significant percentage of the buildings where I had been enslaved. It was aggressive, it was complicated, it required perfect timing and a lot of luck. But I had spent 18 years being patient. I knew how to wait for exactly the right moment. The plan came together in the final month before my scheduled wedding. The health department inspections happened first, coordinated to hit all 7 restaurants during the same week. The violations were extensive and well documented. My evidence, combined with the inspectors' real-time observations, created an overwhelming case. 5 of the 7 restaurants were shut down immediately pending remediation. The other 2 were given warning notices with short deadlines to correct violations. The closures created an immediate cash flow crisis. The Zhangs had been counting on revenue from all 7 locations to meet their various obligations. Suddenly losing 5 revenue streams while still carrying all their debt obligations pushed them into the financial danger zone. Then the labor violations case became public. Jennifer had been coordinating with federal investigators, and they had been building their own case based on my evidence. When they were ready, they moved simultaneously, raiding the restaurants, interviewing employees, seizing records. The story hit local news. Prominent restaurant family under investigation for labor trafficking, child exploitation, forced labor. It was devastating to the Zhang family's reputation. Customers stopped coming to the 2 restaurants that were still open. Business partners distanced themselves, and Mr. Wang, the man I was supposed to marry, quietly withdrew his investment offer and stopped returning Mr. Zhang's calls. The Zhangs were in free fall, and I was just getting started. With the revenue gone and the investment deal canceled, the Zhangs quickly began defaulting on their debts. The mortgage payments were missed. The landlords for the leased properties began eviction proceedings. Suppliers demanded immediate payment for outstanding invoices. The real estate investment firm I had partnered with moved in, offering to purchase the 3 properties that the Zhangs owned. The offers were low, reflecting the distressed nature of the situation, but the Zhangs had no choice. They needed cash immediately to avoid complete financial collapse. The sales went through, and per my agreement with the investment firm, I became a 40% stakeholder in the properties where I had spent 18 years working as an unpaid slave. I owned the buildings. The Zhangs were now tenants in properties I controlled. But I still wasn't done. The final confrontation happened on what was supposed to be my wedding day. The Zhangs had tried to keep up appearances, tried to pretend that everything could somehow still work out. They had even continued with some of the wedding preparations, as if forcing me to marry Mr. Wang was still a possibility, as if they still had any control over my life. I let them maintain that delusion right up until the moment I walked into the office, not the restaurant office, but the family's home office, accompanied by Jennifer, 2 FBI agents, a representative from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and a camera crew from a local news station that had been covering the trafficking investigation. The look on their faces when they saw me, not in a wedding dress, but in a business suit, accompanied by federal agents, was something I will remember for the rest of my life. "What is this?" Mr. Zhang demanded, standing up from his desk. "Lily, what have you done?" "My name is Lily Chen," I said calmly, "not Lily Zhang. I was never really your daughter. I was your slave." I had prepared a statement, and I delivered it clearly, looking directly at the camera. For 18 years, the Zhang family has used me as unpaid labor in their restaurant business. They adopted me from China when I was 4 years old, not to give me a family, but to acquire a worker they wouldn't have to pay. They denied me education, denied me health care, denied me every right that a child in America is supposed to have. Mrs. Zhang was shaking her head frantically. "This is lies. We gave her a home. I have documentation," I continued, ignoring her. 18 years of documentation. Recordings of you discussing how much money you saved by using me instead of paid employees. Photographs of the conditions you kept me in. Testimony from employees who witnessed what you did. All of it time-stamped, verified, and authenticated. I nodded to Jennifer, who began distributing folders to the FBI agents. The evidence in these folders supports federal charges of human trafficking for forced labor, child labor law violations, tax fraud, and conspiracy to commit trafficking for sexual exploitation through the forced marriage arrangement you tried to orchestrate. Mr. Zhang's face had gone from red to white. "You can't prove any of this. It's your word against ours." "It's not my word," I said. "It's hours of audio recordings in your own voices. It's photographs and documents and witness testimony. It's evidence that federal investigators have been reviewing for months." One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Zhang, we have a warrant for your arrest. You have the right to remain silent." I tuned out the Miranda rights, watching as the Zhangs were handcuffed. Susan was crying, insisting she had nothing to do with this, that she hadn't known what her parents were doing. Jason, who had been sitting silently in the corner, just looked shocked. When the agents had finished processing the arrests and were leading my former adoptive parents out to their vehicle, I spoke once more. "One more thing, the properties you sold last month, the buildings for Golden Dragon, Jade Palace, and Lucky Fortune restaurants. I own 40% of those properties now, and the investment firm that owns the other 60% has agreed to sell to me over the next 5 years. Eventually, I'll own 100%. I paused, letting that sink in. "The buildings where you forced me to work 16-hour days, they're mine now. The businesses you built on my unpaid labor, they're closed and they'll never reopen. Everything you created by exploiting me has been taken away." Mrs. Zhang was screaming now, calling me ungrateful, calling me a liar, promising that their lawyers would destroy me. The FBI agents had to physically guide her toward the door. I watched them go, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it. The news coverage of the arrests was extensive. The story had everything that captured public attention. wealthy family brought down by their own crimes, adopted daughter who escaped slavery, federal trafficking charges, with the potential for decades in prison. I gave several interviews, carefully and calmly explaining what had happened to me. I showed the evidence, enough to prove my claims without compromising the criminal case. I spoke about the importance of protecting vulnerable children, about the systems that had failed to notice what was happening to me, about the need for better oversight of adoption and homeschooling situations. I became, somewhat accidentally, a public figure, an advocate, a voice for other victims who had experienced similar situations. The Zhang family was tried and convicted 14 months after their arrest. Mr. Zhang received 23 years in federal prison. Mrs. Zhang received 18 years. Both were ordered to pay restitution, money they didn't have, since all their assets had been seized or sold. Susan and Jason were not charged criminally. The investigation concluded that while they had benefited from my exploitation, they had been minors for much of the relevant period, and there wasn't sufficient evidence that they had actively participated in the trafficking conspiracy. But they suffered in other ways. Their social circles evaporated. Their job prospects were damaged by association with the family scandal. The trust funds that were supposed to secure their futures had been emptied to pay legal fees and restitution. They tried to reach out to me several times, looking for help, looking for forgiveness, looking for some acknowledgement that we had been family once. I didn't respond. Whatever connection we might have had was severed the moment they stood by and watched me be exploited without ever speaking up. As for me, I spent the next several years rebuilding myself. I enrolled in community college, starting with basic courses to fill the educational gaps that 18 years without schooling had created. I was older than my classmates and had to work harder to catch up, but I had learned patience. Within 2 years, I had earned enough credits to transfer to a 4-year university. I studied business and law, driven by a desire to understand the systems that had failed me and to help others navigate similar situations. I graduated with honors, then went to law school, focusing on human rights and trafficking law. During all of this, I was also managing my property investments. The buildings I had acquired through the Zhang family's downfall became the foundation of a small real estate portfolio. I learned property management, tenant relations, and commercial real estate investment. The restaurants that had been sites of my exploitation were converted into other businesses: a bookstore, a community center, a nonprofit that provided services to trafficking survivors. I wanted those spaces to represent something other than suffering. I wanted to transform them into places that helped people rather than harmed them. By the time I was 30, I had my law degree, a growing real estate portfolio, and a reputation as an advocate for trafficking survivors. I had built a life that was entirely my own, funded by my own work, defined by my own choices. I had also maintained my documentation habits. I recorded everything, backed up everything, protected myself with the same thoroughness that had allowed me to bring down the Zhangs. I had learned that evidence was power, and I wasn't going to be powerless ever again. The years continued to pass. I took on legal cases representing other trafficking victims, using my own experience to understand what they were going through and to fight for their rights with a personal intensity that most attorneys couldn't match. I won more cases than I lost, and I built a reputation that made prosecutors nervous when they saw my name on the opposing counsel line. I also continued to grow my real estate holdings, expanding beyond the original 3 properties into a larger portfolio. I wasn't trying to build an empire. I had no desire to become the kind of exploitative landlord that I despised, but I wanted security. I wanted to know that I would never again be in a position where someone else controlled my survival. And I wanted to be able to help others who were where I had been. I established a foundation that provided housing and support services to people escaping trafficking situations. The foundation operated several buildings, some that I owned, others donated by supporters, that offered safe, affordable housing plus wraparound services like counseling, job training, legal assistance, and education support. It was the kind of help I wished I had received when I was younger, the kind of help that might have shortened the years between realizing I was being exploited and being able to escape that exploitation. I named the foundation after Maria, the restaurant worker who had first suggested to me that I wasn't slow, that something was wrong, that I deserved better. She had returned to Mexico years ago, but I had tracked her down and told her what her kindness had meant to me. She cried when I told her I was naming the foundation in her honor. Some days I would visit the buildings that used to be Golden Dragon, Jade Palace, and Lucky Fortune. I would walk through the bookstore that occupied the Golden Dragon space, running my fingers along the shelves full of books that I now had the freedom to read. I would sit in the community center that had replaced Jade Palace, watching people take classes and attend meetings and build connections. I would volunteer at the nonprofit that operated out of the old Lucky Fortune building, helping other survivors navigate systems that I now understood intimately. And I would think about the girl who had slept on a cot in a storage room, who had believed she was slow and lucky and obligated to repay a debt she never owed. That girl was gone. She had been transformed by years of struggle and study and deliberate self-construction into someone else entirely. But I hadn't forgot her. I carried her with me, not as a burden but as a reminder of where I had come from, what I had survived, and why the work I was doing mattered. Last year, I received a letter from Mrs. Zhang. She was in prison, serving year 7 of her 18-year sentence. The letter was handwritten, several pages long, and it began with an apology. She wrote about regret, about the choices she had made, about how the desire for financial success had blinded her to the humanity of the child she had adopted. She wrote about therapy she had been doing in prison, about finally confronting what she had done. She wrote about wanting to make amends, though she acknowledged that nothing she could do would undo the harm she had caused. And she asked for forgiveness. I read the letter carefully, multiple times, trying to assess its sincerity. Part of me wanted to believe that she had genuinely changed, that she had used her time in prison to become a better person. Part of me suspected that this was just another manipulation, an attempt to ease her guilt or improve her chances at parole. In the end, I decided it didn't matter which was true. I didn't owe her forgiveness. I didn't owe her anything. Whatever healing she needed to do was her responsibility, not mine. I wrote a brief response. I acknowledge your letter and your apology. I hope you use the remainder of your sentence to continue reflecting on the choices that brought you here. I will not be corresponding with you again. I sent it, then filed her letter away in a drawer with other documents from that period of my life. I wasn't going to forget what had happened. Forgetting would be a betrayal of the child I had been, but I also wasn't going to let it consume my present. I had built too much, come too far, to let the Zhangs occupy space in my life that could be better used for other things. Around the same time, I started receiving speaking invitations, organizations working on trafficking issues, conferences on adoption reform, law schools teaching about human rights. They all wanted to hear my story. They wanted to understand how someone had survived 18 years of exploitation and then successfully brought her traffickers to justice. I was selective about what I accepted. I didn't want to become someone whose identity was solely defined by victimhood, even a victimhood that had been overcome. But I did want to use my experience to help others, to shed light on systems that allowed exploitation, to push for reforms that might prevent other children from experiencing what I had. So I spoke, I told my story over and over in courtrooms and classrooms and conference halls. I described what trafficking looked like when it happened in plain sight, in a successful business, in a family that appeared respectable. I explained how someone could be enslaved in America in the 21st century, hidden by paperwork and assumptions, and the belief that adoption was always benevolent. And I emphasized what had saved me: documentation, patience, and a refusal to believe that powerlessness was permanent. The people who exploit you want you to believe that you have no options, I would tell audiences. They want you to believe that resistance is futile, that the system will always side with them, that your truth is less important than their reputation. And sometimes in the moment that might be accurate, but situations change, power shifts, and if you document everything, if you wait for your moment, if you prepare yourself for the opportunity when it comes, you can win. I would show them my evidence folders, the ones I had built starting when I was 15. I would explain my methodology: always record, always back up, always verify. I would walk them through the steps I had taken to go from having evidence to having leverage to having victory. And I would see recognition in the eyes of some of the people listening, recognition that they were in similar situations, recognition that escape might be possible, recognition that they weren't as powerless as they had been told. Those moments made the speaking worthwhile. This year I turned 33. I have a law degree, a successful practice, a real estate portfolio worth several $1 million, and a foundation that has helped hundreds of trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. I have friends who care about me for who I am rather than what I can provide. I have professional colleagues who respect my expertise. I have a life that is entirely my own, shaped by my choices rather than someone else's exploitation. I also have something I never expected: a relationship. Her name is Amy, and I met her 3 years ago when she was a client of the foundation. She had escaped a trafficking situation similar to mine, labor trafficking in a family business, years of exploitation disguised as help, and she had come to us looking for housing and legal support. We connected immediately, recognizing in each other the particular kind of strength that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. Our relationship developed slowly from professional to friendship to something more. We've been together now for 2 years, and she's the first person I've ever felt safe enough with to let down all my defenses. She knows everything about my past, I know everything about hers, and we're building something together that neither of us thought we'd have, a future that isn't defined by what was done to us, but by what we're creating for ourselves. We talk sometimes about the strange path that brought us here, how the worst things that happened to us ended up being the foundation for the best things in our lives, how we wouldn't be who we are, wouldn't have the strength, the insight, the determination that defines us, without having survived what we survived. I don't want to be grateful for what they did to me, Amy said once. I'll never be grateful for that, but I can be grateful for who I became in spite of them. I understood exactly what she meant. Last month, I did something I hadn't done in years. I visited the cemetery where Mr. Zhang was buried. He had died in prison 2 years ago, a heart attack at 63. I hadn't attended the funeral, hadn't acknowledged his death in any public way, but on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the cemetery and found his grave. I stood there for a long time, looking at the simple headstone that bore his name and dates. I thought about everything he had done to me, everything he had stolen, every lie he had told. And I realized that I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction at his death, not even the complex mixture of emotions I might have expected, just nothing. He was gone, and his being gone didn't change anything about my life or my work or my future. He had been important to me once, as an obstacle, as an enemy, as the person I needed to defeat. But I had defeated him years ago, and his actual death was just a footnote to a story that had already ended. I left the cemetery and went back to my office, where I had client meetings and foundation work, and a life that had nothing to do with the Zhangs or what they had tried to make me. And I realized that this indifference, this ability to move through the world without being defined by what had happened to me, this was the real victory. Not the convictions, not the property ownership, not the public vindication. The real victory was becoming someone who didn't need those things to know her own worth. The real victory was freedom. Today, I'm working on a case that reminds me of my own story. A 16-year-old girl brought to America by relatives who promised her education and opportunity, then used her as unpaid domestic labor. She's scared, traumatized, and unsure whether fighting back is even possible. I sit across from her in my office, and I see myself at that age. I see the doubt, the fear, the ingrained belief that she is powerless. I can't prove anything, she tells me, her voice barely above a whisper. I have no evidence, it's just my word against theirs. I pull out a folder, one I've prepared specifically for cases like this. Let me tell you about evidence, I say, and let me tell you how we're going to build a case that they can't defend against. I spend the next hour teaching her what I learned, how to document, how to preserve evidence, how to build a record that will be undeniable when the time comes. I watch the change in her expression as she realizes that she isn't powerless, that she has options, that someone believes her and is willing to fight beside her. This is what I do now, this is who I've become. Not the girl who was exploited, not the victim who survived, but the attorney who fights, the advocate who wins, the person who takes the worst thing that ever happened to her and transforms it into a weapon to protect others. The servant became the master. And the master is using her power to burn down every system that allowed servants to be exploited in the first place. That's my story, that's my victory, and that's the work that will define the rest of my life. Clapper board if you made it to the end of this story. Clapper board. First of all, thank you. Thank you for witnessing Lily's journey. Thank you for caring about what happened to her. Thank you for being part of this community that believes justice matters. Now I need you to do something for me. Like this video if it made you feel something. Seriously, if this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you cry, if it made you think about the people in your own life who might be going through something similar, hit that like button right now. And subscribe to this channel, bell. We have so many more stories coming. Stories about people who were exploited and fought back. stories about underdogs who became unstoppable, stories about justice that was delayed but never denied. Every single story is carefully researched, carefully told, and designed to remind you that the people who count you out are making the biggest mistake of their lives. Hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, be here for the next one. And I want you to do one more thing. Share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that fighting back is possible. Share it with someone who has been told they're powerless. Share it with someone who is documenting their own exploitation and wondering if it will ever matter. Your share might be the thing that changes someone's life. Also, drop a comment below and tell me, what moment in Lily's story hit you the hardest? Was it when the Zhangs tried to sell her into marriage? Was it when she revealed she owned the buildings? Was it when she walked into that office with federal agents? I want to hear from you. I want to build this community. I want us all to support each other in the belief that justice matters and that fighting back is not only possible, it's necessary. So like, subscribe, comment, and share. This channel exists because of you. These stories reach people because you help them spread. This community grows because you're part of it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that stories like Lily's matter. See you in the next one, Black Heart. Stay powerful, stay unstoppable, and never let anyone convince you that you're powerless. Because you're not, none of us are. We'll see you soon.